Welcome to Presence, a global conversation for a new earth.
And hello, everybody, and welcome to Presence. I am your host, Doug King. Thanks for joining me. I had originally intended to have the second episode of our series, A Global Conversation with Dr. Rian Eisler, to be the video I did for evolutionary leaders. It is still being completed and packaged because it's going to be sent out to a lot of different groups, which is the exciting news for Presence, is that our message is now going out to more and more groups, but it's not ready for today. So we'll hopefully have that for next week. But what I wanted to do was to talk a little bit theology. Hey, you can never go wrong with talking theology. And so I wanted to talk about the biblical narrative regarding dominator hierarchies versus partnership societies, partnership families. And specifically today, I want to go into the biblical narrative, take a look at the story, make some observations about the religion of Christianity with regard to gender and dominator hierarchies, and the importance of the role that gender plays in the narrative, even into the eschatological movement that transcends gender. So gender is a big deal. So let's do some theology. Let's start in the beginning. In the beginning, what happens? In the creation, there is the apex of male and female. And not only is there the story beginning with gender, male and female, when you get to Genesis chapter 2, the story says that the two will become one. So immediately, the narrative is painting a picture of partnership, and that the idea of the nature of male and female in role and function is that of partnership. Now, on the other hand, domination hierarchies, dominator hierarchies, identify power and authority to a specific group, and then everyone else is a subject. So when we look at the narrative, it begins with the story of power and authority as being male dominant. That's where it begins. It's going to end differently, but that's where it begins. For example, the 12 tribes. The 12 tribes come from 12 sons, and identity is from the male genealogy. So identity is connected with the concept of male. And that's why we read of the genealogies of begat, so on and so forth. When we look at hierarchies within Israel, again, at the beginning of the story and at the beginning of early history for that matter, she was like all other nations. This was common in all other nations, the embedded male hierarchy that existed. Within Israel, it was symbolized by the position of king and priest. The priesthood, high priest, all the priests were male. When we look at the Davidic line of kings, they are all male. Priesthood, of course, had power and authority regarding the law regarding sacrificial systems. The high priest was an authoritarian position. If you recall, when Paul was acting as Saul of Tarsus in his persecution, the reason he went to Damascus was he got letters of authority from the high priest. And then also, the high priest administered the atonement and all the various sacrifices that went with that. So priesthood was related to both keeping the law as well as providing forgiveness when that law is broken. That was the power and authority associated with priest. And again, priest was male. The king was the protector of the nation of Israel, the tribes, and kings went to war. They went to war to defend the nation and the land in which the people were dwelling. Kings shed the blood of others, and therefore they were separate from the priesthood. The priesthood did not shed the blood of others. The king represented the power of protection and the ultimate authority to make decisions in guiding the people. So there we have it. We have king and priest. I want to talk about them specifically regarding gender and the transformation of it. So if we go to Zechariah chapter 6, Zechariah is talking about one called the branch. And this was a symbol or metaphor used to speak of a coming one who would be a priest on the throne. Now, how could this be when he made this prophecy? Because those two positions were from two different tribes, two different genealogies. The Davidic lineage was from the tribe of Judah, and that was the lineage from which Jesus came. But the priesthood came through the Levitical. And so how could two different tribes eventually produce a priest who sat on the throne? And if Jesus came from the lineage of Judah, what right did he have to claim the position of high priest, a position which we'll take a look at here in a few minutes, that was spoken of in a lot of detail by the Hebrews writer? So when I look at Christ as role and function, primarily Christ came to fulfill. Jesus in the beginning said, I came to fulfill, not destroy, but to fulfill. And in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus more specifically says that he came to fulfill the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. Very interesting, included the Psalms. And Jesus, Paul said, came in the fullness of time. So look, when something is full, it's complete. Jesus was bringing about the completion, the fullness of that which the story had introduced from the beginning. And Luke also reports the angel saying that Mary's son would be given the throne of David. Here is Luke introducing the concept of Jesus as king. But when you look at the Gospels, there's nothing said about Jesus as high priest. And that's because Jesus fulfilled that role at the cross. And that's why the writer of Hebrews gives us so much information about the role of Christ as priest, because Hebrews was written post-cross. It was the cross event, not genealogical lineage from Levi, but rather it was the cross event that determined and gave Jesus the position of high priest in the work of God for the purpose of the restoration of all things, the fulfillment of all things, the reconciliation of the world. That was the role and function of Christ as priest. So Jesus then was fulfilling the priest who would sit on the throne. And in fact, in that role and in that generation, genealogy and identity related to male genealogy vanished, ended at the Roman invasion of Jerusalem in the first century. Since that point forward, male genealogical identity was lost. But that's because a different understanding of identity was coming. Well, let me say this. A different understanding of identity was supposed to be coming. I'll talk more about that in a second. So Paul, of course, understood what the writer of Hebrews was saying. And Paul pointed out the very famous phrase that I think most all of us are familiar with, that there's neither male nor female in Christ. Christ was not determining identity via male or female. So this significance of a priest on the throne was really all about the transformation of power and authority from human hands into the realm of God. Because remember, Israel requested a king. And God said to Samuel that this represented a rejection of God's power and authority. Israel wanted to possess the power and authority via their own king. So Israel's request was one to actually have the power and authority themselves. And this is nothing less than a coveting that would really relate to the instinctual self, because the instinctual self is that which wants control. The instinctual self needs as much power as it can possibly get, because its job is to protect survival. And you can never have too much power to protect survival. But that instinctual self had the ability, through the human mind of reason, to extend into the realm of the spiritual and therefore attempt to grasp the power that belonged to God through the instinctual self instead. So Christ again was already introduced as the one after David regarding kingship. And when we read Paul goes into great detail about the last enemy to be destroyed, and that's sin and death. Now remember, the role of the king was to protect the people from the enemies. So Christ is king with regard to defeating the enemy, sin, death, and separation. But he did not sit on the throne of David as David did. David defeated Israel's enemies by the sword. But Jesus said in the garden to Peter, "Put down the sword, because my kingdom is not of this world." By saying that, Jesus was acknowledging himself as king. You can't have a kingdom unless you're the king. And so put down the sword was the work and role of Jesus. None of the Davidic kings could defeat the Goliath of sin and death, not even David. That's why sin and death are the final enemy, an enemy that still stood strong when Jesus appears on the scene in the first century. But the cross event was when Jesus died to the world that had human beings in bondage to sin and death, in order that the world to come, of which he spoke, could be the end result, or we might say the result that brought fulfillment, the result that brought completion to the work of God, restoring all things, reconciling, etc. And when we look at the source of power in the narrative, when we get to Jesus in the transformation of power and authority from male dominator hierarchies associated with one's identity, even religious identity, the narrative is very specific and very clear. Jesus was raised by the power of the Spirit of God. That was the source of power. And Jesus himself even said, all authority was given to him by God as source. Jesus himself said that he was going to return in power and glory. But this was all related to the power and authority of God. It had nothing to do with human doing. So Christ became high priest by sacrificing the power of his instinctual self. He knew, of myself, I can do nothing, and that the only power that would produce for him a life beyond biological form was the power of spirit. And that's why the followers of Christ were told repeatedly about the need to crucify the self. They were simply imitating Christ. So the writer of Hebrews said this was all a symbol or metaphor for Christ appearing before God, not with the blood of animals, but with his own blood. Blood of animals, that's an external thing, but his own blood, a symbol of giving up all power and authority from self as source. And so, Paul, especially in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul speaks of Jesus delivering up the kingdom to God. The kingdom represents power and authority, and Israel had requested that power and authority be in her own hands with her own king, and therefore kingdom was represented via the power of Israel. And self as source. The work of Jesus as priest on the throne was one of delivering up the kingdom to God, meaning restoring the power and authority. This is part of the restoration of all things. What was being restored? What was being restored was the rightful power and authority that belonged to God and God alone. So, in this way, Christ becomes a high priest, not via genealogy, but via crucifixion. Christ was the high priest whose work was once and for all. Once, as in this generation, and for all, meaning all people. Once again, the word all is pervasive throughout the work of Christ and God in Christ. All in Christ versus all in Adam. God has found all under disobedience, that he might have mercy upon all. This all in all God, bringing about an all in all restoration of all things. So when Christ defeats the last enemy of sin and death, he delivers up the kingdom, meaning power and authority, to God. And Christ then, Paul says, becomes subject to God because his role and function is fulfilled. There's the role and function of Jesus fulfilled, completed. That was his role as given to him by God. Now let's think for a minute about what happened when Jesus and the apostles left the scene. Again, we've talked about this before. The Roman Empire at that time took the teachings of Jesus and the apostles, and they interpreted those teachings as the coming of a new form or new world religion that sat in contrast or opposition to the religion of Moses. The Roman Empire's interpretation transcended and excluded. And I bring that phrase in because we've talked many times in spiral dynamics that the model of evolution through big history is one of transcend and include. Christianity was a movement that transcended and excluded. That's the opposite of what Jesus said about his intended role and function. And of course, when the Roman Empire interpreted Christology as a form, an institution, boundary-driven, differentiated from all other religions, they had to give that form an organized structure for it to function. And so they regressed into male dominator hierarchy. After all, who had the power and authority? It was the Pope, cardinals, bishops, and priests. A male dominated hierarchy where the power and authority of what one could believe, should believe, must believe was in the hands of that male dominated hierarchy, and women were simply subjects. And it remained that way for some 1,500 years. Then, okay, we've got Protestantism coming. Good. Protestant Christianity came. But the male authoritarian hierarchies remained, for the most part, very much in place. And today you will find pockets of progressive Christianity that have some involvement by female pastors, etc. But for the most part, when you look at ordination boards and seminaries, and you look at synods and committees and various different denominations, it is very much a male dominator hierarchy that has the power and the authority. And really, if you look at Christianity just as a religion, it has very much been a dominator hierarchy. Christianity has a history of persecuting so many different groups of people in the last 2,000 years, as it has set itself up as superior to all other religions. This is not partnership as it is intended. This is dominator. And you will not be able to find in Christianity what we're talking about in terms of partnership, because it is an interpretation of Christology as a religious form. It has a history of colonialism, Has intruded into other cultures to convert them into their world religion. And now, more than ever, Christianity is failing. Why is that? It is failing because form is subject to corruption. Only form can come to an end, not that which is formless. The formlessness as source is God as source or spirit as source, and it cannot suffer corruption or come to an end. And because form can come to an end, and it is in the realm of the corruptible, we should not be shocked that last year 4,600 churches closed their door. And we should be hopeful that eventually theologians and others who have the power and authority over congregations and ordinations and so on will join this conversation about transcending the restricted message of Jesus to a particularistic piece of the globe, or the story of God as only being applicable to primarily, really, the US. With regard to gender, power, and authority, all that comes from God as source. Male and female become one, meaning a partnership. We all walk hand in hand. No one is subject to another with regard to identity. But everyone and everything is subject to God and God alone. The only power in the universe is from God as source. My life becomes more abundant as I grow in my alignment with that power, as I allow that power to come through me, because of myself, I can do nothing. And my anxieties about the future, or what will happen here, or what will happen there, cannot be under my control. Other people will make their own decisions in life, whether it's loved ones within my family, or whether it's just people that are friends, or people that I see suffering in countries around the world. But one thing I know is the source of the only power that exists in this universe is the source of spirit. And I do my best each day to become more aware of how I can better align myself with that power. And I pray in light of that being the only power. And that's what I'm reminded of when I think of Jesus saying, not my will, not my power, but thy will be done. Gender is a biological form. Christianity is a religious form. And that's why gender plays such an important role in teaching all of us what it's about to transcend into the realm of universal, formless God identity. So, those are my thoughts that I wanted to insert here, throw in a little theology before we get to our videos with Dr. Rian Eisler. I'm hopeful that next week, the video that's going out to all the evolutionary leaders with Rian and myself will be available for us. The following week, I have already just recorded a video with Rian for the presence audience. That will come the following week. And then the last week of this series, I'm going to be doing with Danae. And we are, as partners in a partnership relation, we're going to talk about an aspect of the four cornerstones that are proposed by Rian. You'll hear about them in these next two videos. Cornerstone number one relates to childhood, raising children, the narrative, raising children, And Danae has some great content, some things that she's written in her work in Enneagram teaching and so forth. And there were a few things specifically that she wrote regarding childhood that I thought were very much worth sharing. And she and I have had some really great coffee conversations, as we are prone to do. And so I said, hey, look, come on. I want you as the last. I want you to come in as the last guest, if you will, in the series. So that'll be the way we wrap it up. Until then, till next week, I hope everything goes well in your world, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at info@presence.tv. You can also visit our website at presence.tv or find us on Facebook. We look forward to hearing from you.